The gavel hadn't even struck yet, but the room was already suffocating in tension. It wasn't the usual kind, the kind where the accused fidgeted, lawyers whispered, and spectators murmured. No, this was different. This was the kind of silence that came before a storm. Judge Grayson Holloway sat high above the room, his fingers tapping lazily against his polished mahogany bench. 62 years old, white hair combed neatly back, deep lines etched into his face from years of scowling at defendants. He was the law here, or at least he liked to think so. He glanced down at the case file before him, barely skimming it. Another open and shut case, another defendant who thought the rules didn't apply to them. He smirked, shifting in his chair. This wouldn't take long. At the defense table, a woman sat with her back impossibly straight, hands folded neatly in front of her. Danielle Carter, professional, calm, unshaken. The navy blue suit she wore was crisp, her dark hair pulled into a no-nonsense bun. Everything about her radiated control, but to Holloway, she was just another face in a sea of troublemakers. Well, well, he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. Another entitled citizen thinking the law doesn't apply to them. A few jurors shifted uncomfortably. The prosecutor, a sharp-looking man in his 30s, pressed his lips together but didn't speak. Nobody did. The judge's word was final in this room. Danielle, however, remained still. No flinching, no panicked glances at her lawyer, not even a twitch of discomfort. Just an eerie, composed silence. Holloway narrowed his eyes. He'd seen defendants act tough before, putting on a show of bravado. But there was something different here. It wasn't defiance, it wasn't arrogance, it was control. Absolute, unwavering control. He leaned forward, amused. I assume you're here to claim wrongful arrest? That this is all just a big misunderstanding? The room stayed silent. Then finally she moved. Not much, just a slow, deliberate tilt of her head, the corners of her lips curling up ever so slightly. It wasn't a nervous smile. It wasn't even a polite one. It was the kind of smile that made people uneasy, the kind that hinted at something others didn't know yet. Holloway's smirk faltered, but only for a second. He cleared his throat, regaining his confidence. All right, Miss Carter, let's hear your facts. Danielle inhaled slowly and reached into the inner pocket of her blazer. Immediately, the bailiff stiffened. The judge's instinct was to scoff, to make a comment about reckless behavior in a courtroom, but something stopped him. It was the way she moved. Calm, controlled, unbothered by the growing tension in the room. Then she pulled it out. A small black leather case. She flipped it open and placed it on the table in front of her. For the first time in years, Judge Holloway felt his stomach drop. The room, already silent, somehow became even quieter. Inside the case was a golden badge, bold, unmistakable letters engraved across it. U.S. Secret Service. The prosecutor's pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the table. A few jurors leaned forward, eyes widening in disbelief. The spectators exchanged hushed gasps. Judge Holloway's face lost its color. Danielle placed the badge down like a winning hand in poker. Then, in a voice as steady as ever, she said, "My name is Special Agent Danielle Carter, United States Secret Service." The weight of those words crushed the room. Judge Holloway gripped the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. The polished wood felt cold beneath his fingers, but his skin was burning. For the first time in decades, he was at a loss for words. The courtroom had seen plenty of surprises, but nothing like this. Nothing that could make a man like him, who built a career on being untouchable, feel a rare, creeping sense of dread. He forced himself to speak, but his voice came out quieter than he intended. "Excuse me?" Danielle didn't blink. "I am a federal agent, and as of this moment, I am not the one on trial." The weight of her words pressed into the room like a physical force. Holloway wanted to scoff, to laugh, to brush it off as an elaborate bluff. But the badge was real. That much was obvious. And worse, she didn't look like someone who needed to bluff. The prosecutor finally found his voice, though it came out unsteady. "Your Honor, I was not made aware of this information prior to today." Holloway barely heard him. His mind was moving too fast, unraveling possibilities, calculating how this could have happened. How had no one caught this? The arrest report listed Carter as an uncooperative suspect found at the scene of a federal investigation, yet there wasn't a single mention of her credentials. She let the silence stretch, watching him. It wasn't a power move, it was something worse. It was patience, the kind of patience that belonged to people who already knew they had won. Holloway swallowed. "Agent Carter," he said carefully, his usual arrogance replaced with something dangerously close to caution. If what you're claiming is true, then there has been a grave mistake. A small flicker of something unreadable passed across her face. Then, with the same deliberate movements, she reached into her bag again. A sealed envelope slid onto the table. "This," she said, her voice even, "is a formal complaint from the Department of Justice." Holloway's jaw tightened. His chest felt heavy. He didn't need to open the envelope to know what was inside. If the DOJ was involved, then this was no longer just about a case. It was about him, about his courtroom, about his judgment. Danielle tapped the folder lightly. Inside are documented violations including false arrest, mishandling of evidence, and obstruction of a federal investigation. The words hit harder than a gavel. The prosecutor stiffened. The jury exchanged uneasy glances. Even the bailiff, who had stood still this entire time, shifted uncomfortably. Holloway knew what was happening. This wasn't just about her. This was about accountability. And for a man who had spent decades ensuring he never had to answer for his decisions, that was the real danger here. Danielle leaned back slightly. "Your Honor," she said, her voice as steady as ever, "before this court proceeds any further, I suggest we address the fact that I should never have been in this courtroom to begin with." For the first time in his career, Judge Holloway had no idea what to say. Judge Holloway's pulse hammered against his ribs. He had spent decades in this chair, handing down sentences, controlling the rhythm of the courtroom. But today, the power was slipping from his grasp. The weight of the badge on the table, the sealed DOJ complaint, it all pressed against him like a slow-moving avalanche, threatening to bury him under the consequences of his own arrogance. The prosecutor cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "Your Honor, given these developments, I believe we need to reconsider how we proceed with this case." His words were careful, measured, like a man stepping over broken glass. He knew what was at stake. Holloway inhaled sharply through his nose. He wanted to shut this down, regain control, but every possible move felt like quicksand. His reputation, his authority, both were now teetering on the edge, and Danielle Carter knew it. She hadn't moved. She simply watched, waiting, calculating. It wasn't defiance, it wasn't arrogance, it was something much worse. It was certainty. He clenched his jaw. "Miss Carter." "Agent Carter," she corrected, her voice calm but firm. "I didn't spend years in federal service to have my title dismissed in a courtroom that should respect it." A sharp murmur rippled through the spectators. It was subtle, but it was there. A shift, a crack in the foundation Holloway had built his career on. He could feel the weight of their stares now, the quiet judgment settling on his shoulders. His fingers curled into a fist against the desk. "Agent Carter," he forced out, his voice tight. "You were arrested at a federal crime scene under suspicious circumstances. If you truly are who you claim to be, then why were you there? Why weren't your credentials presented at the time of your detainment?" For the first time, Danielle tilted her head, as if mildly intrigued by the question. Then, without breaking eye contact, she reached into the folder she had placed on the table and pulled out another document. She slid it forward with deliberate ease. "This," she said, "is my field assignment report from the day of my arrest. It includes classified details about an active federal investigation. You'll notice, Judge Holloway, that my presence at the scene was not only authorized, it was mandated." The prosecutor leaned forward, scanning the document with widening eyes. He exhaled sharply. This changes everything." Holloway's stomach twisted. He could feel the walls closing in now. He had gone too far, dismissed her too quickly, and now the evidence was stacking against him. Danielle clasped her hands together. "Your Honor, I was detained unlawfully. My badge was ignored, my authority was disregarded, and now I find myself sitting in front of a judge who decided my guilt before hearing a single piece of evidence." A few jurors exchanged glances. The shift in the room was palpable now. Holloway exhaled through gritted teeth. "This is highly irregular." Danielle's lips curved into that same unreadable smile. "Yes," she agreed. "Yes, it is." The courtroom felt different now. It wasn't just tense, it was shifting, like the balance of power had tilted ever so slightly, and everyone in the room knew it. Judge Holloway sat rigid, his fingers still curled against the desk, but his posture had changed. The arrogance, the dismissive confidence, it was starting to crack. Danielle Carter had done nothing more than present facts. No theatrics, no grandstanding, just cold, irrefutable truth. And that was the problem. Holloway had built his career on controlling the narrative, on ensuring that every person who stood before him knew exactly who held the power. But this was something else entirely. He could feel the prosecutor's eyes on him, could sense the jury processing every detail. He needed to regain control, and fast. He cleared his throat, forcing authority back into his voice. Agent Carter, even if your presence at the scene was authorized, the officers who detained you acted under the belief that— Danielle cut him off. Belief, she echoed, her voice sharp but calm. We're discussing law, not belief. A murmur rippled through the courtroom again, this time sharper. It wasn't open defiance, no one would dare, but it was a reaction, a shift in the atmosphere. Holloway's jaw tightened. I suggest you tread carefully. Danielle met his stare without hesitation. I suggest the same. Silence. The prosecutor adjusted his tie, clearly uncomfortable. He knew where this was heading. Everyone did. Danielle took a slow breath. Your Honor, let's be clear about what happened here. I was arrested without probable cause. My credentials were ignored, and rather than acknowledge the severity of that mistake, this court proceeded as if I were just another defendant on trial. Holloway's fingers tapped against the desk again, this time slower. A tell, a small, involuntary reaction to pressure. Danielle reached into her folder one last time. This time she pulled out a transcript. She slid it across the table toward the prosecutor, whose eyes flickered with hesitation before he picked it up. As he scanned the words, his face paled slightly. This is a copy of the radio communication between the arresting officers and dispatch, Danielle said. Notice how at no point do they mention checking my ID. Notice how they joke about my attitude instead. Notice how even after realizing their mistake, they processed my arrest anyway. The prosecutor's throat bobbed as he swallowed. He glanced at Holloway, then back at the transcript, then at Danielle. This is damning, he admitted. Holloway knew it. The room knew it. But admitting it, that was something else entirely. Danielle leaned back, her expression unreadable. Your Honor, she said, her voice smooth, unwavering. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about what happens next. For the first time since the trial began, Judge Holloway had nothing to say. Judge Holloway's grip on control had never felt weaker. The courtroom, once his domain, had become something else, a stage where his authority was unraveling in real time. He could feel the weight of every pair of eyes watching him, waiting, measuring his next move. The evidence sat in front of him, undeniable, damning. And yet, his instinct screamed at him to fight back, to salvage what he could before it was too late. The prosecutor shifted in his seat, still holding the transcript. His face was drawn, his mind clearly racing. He wasn't the only one. The jurors, the spectators, even the bailiff, they all knew something had changed. The case had stopped being about Danielle Carter minutes ago. This was about the system now, about how easily power could be abused, about how dangerous it was when no one was watching. And Holloway? He was the man at the center of it all. Danielle's voice cut through the silence like a scalpel. Your Honor, you have a decision to make. Holloway exhaled slowly, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. Agent Carter, if your claims are accurate— They are, she interrupted. The sharpness of her response made the tension in the room snap even tighter. The prosecutor closed his eyes for half a second as if bracing for impact. Holloway's fingers twitched. Danielle continued, her voice level, controlled. Then this case was built on a false foundation. The charges against me should never have existed. My record should be cleared and those responsible should be held accountable. A low murmur from the spectators, a rustling from the jury. The words accountability and judge rarely occupied the same space. Holloway knew the law. He knew what he should do. But what he wanted to do was something else entirely. To dismiss the case now would be to admit that the system he upheld, the system that kept men like him untouchable, had failed. Worse, it would mean admitting that he had failed. His grip tightened on his gavel. The officers involved in your arrest are not currently under review by this court. Danielle didn't so much as blink. Not yet. A beat of silence. Holloway felt his face grow hot. She wasn't threatening him. She wasn't even challenging him. She was just stating the inevitable. The prosecutor cleared his throat, forcing himself into the conversation. Your Honor, given the overwhelming evidence presented, I move to dismiss all charges against Agent Carter immediately. The words felt like a hammer against Holloway's chest. He should have seen this coming. The moment she pulled out that badge, the moment she laid out her case with an almost surgical precision, he had known, deep down, that this would be the outcome. but knowing it didn't make it any easier to accept. His fingers flexed against the desk. He could feel control slipping further, slipping into a place where he could no longer reach it. The courtroom waited. The gavel felt heavier in his grip. And for the first time in years, Judge Holloway hesitated. Judge Holloway had never hesitated before, not once in his decades behind the bench. His rulings were swift, absolute. That was how he had built his reputation, unyielding, decisive, untouchable. But now, the weight of the gavel in his hand felt different, heavier, as if the very symbol of his authority was working against him. The prosecutor's words still hung in the air. Dismiss all charges immediately. 3 simple words that threatened to unravel everything. Holloway wanted to reject it, to push back, to assert his dominance. But he wasn't a fool. This was no longer a battle he could win. He cleared his throat, his voice tight. "The court needs time to—" "No, Your Honor," Danielle interrupted, her tone still calm, but sharper now. "The court does not need time. The facts are in front of you. Delaying this ruling would only serve one purpose, to protect those who failed to do their jobs." Another murmur rippled through the spectators. Jurors exchanged glances, some with narrowed eyes, others with the kind of expression that made it clear they were already forming opinions beyond the case itself. Holloway's grip tightened around the gavel. "Agent Carter, I do not appreciate being told how to conduct my courtroom." Danielle held his stare, unflinching. "And I do not appreciate being unlawfully arrested, detained, and put on trial in a case that should never have existed." Silence. The prosecutor shifted again, glancing between them. He could see it, the shift happening in real time, the judge scrambling to maintain control, but the moment slipping further and further from his grasp. Holloway exhaled sharply. He didn't like this. He didn't like being backed into a corner. But the more he resisted, the more obvious it became to everyone watching that this was no longer just about law. It was about ego. His ego. He tapped his fingers against the desk, once, twice, the final remnants of his control slipping away. Danielle tilted her head slightly. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is not complicated. Either the charges are dropped now, or we move forward knowing that every second this case remains open is another second the justice system fails the people it claims to serve." That was the final crack. He knew it. He could see it in the faces of the jury, in the prosecutor's barely concealed discomfort, in the growing whispers from the back of the room. The story had already been written. He was just the last one refusing to read it. His jaw clenched so tightly it ached. Then finally, he lifted the gavel. And for the first time in his career, he brought it down with a decision he never wanted to make. Case dismissed. The sound of the gavel echoed through the courtroom, final and absolute. But for the first time in his career, Judge Holloway felt no sense of authority when he struck it. No satisfaction, no control, just the cold realization that he had lost. He kept his face blank, refusing to show anything beyond professional detachment, but inside, his thoughts were a storm. Danielle Carter didn't flinch. She didn't react like most defendants did when hearing those words. No exhale of relief, no visible sign of victory. Instead, she simply gathered the documents in front of her with the same calculated patience she had shown since the moment she walked in. The kind of patience that came from knowing the outcome before the game even started. The courtroom remained silent. No celebration, no outbursts, just the collective awareness that something significant had just happened. Even the jury, who were no longer needed, sat frozen in place, absorbing the weight of what they had just witnessed. The prosecutor ran a hand over his face, clearly rattled. "Your Honor, given these revelations, I expect there will be further—" "We're done here," Holloway cut him off, his voice sharp but lacking its usual bite. He didn't want to hear it. Didn't want to acknowledge that this wouldn't just end with today's ruling. There would be questions, scrutiny, fallout. The DOJ complaint was still real. The officers involved were still at risk, and worst of all, so was he. Danielle stood, smoothing out the front of her blazer, every movement precise, unhurried. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't revel in what had just happened. That made it worse. There was no pleasure in watching him squirm, just inevitability. She reached for the badge still resting on the table and picked it up with practiced ease. Then, as if finally acknowledging the moment, she turned her gaze back to Holloway. "This should have never happened," she said, her voice low, even, not angry, not condescending, just the simple, undeniable truth. Holloway felt the sting of those words more than he expected. Danielle nodded once, then turned toward the exit. The moment she moved, the tension in the room broke. A few jurors murmured to each other. The prosecutor leaned back in his chair as if finally breathing for the first time, and the bailiff shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to make eye contact with the judge. But Holloway didn't look at any of them. His eyes stayed locked on the courtroom doors as they swung open, watching as Danielle Carter walked out, leaving him with the one thing he never thought he'd experience in his own courtroom: powerlessness. Judge Holloway sat motionless, his fingers still wrapped tightly around the gavel, but he didn't slam it down again. He couldn't. The courtroom, his domain, his fortress, no longer felt like his. It was just a room now, a collection of wooden benches and polished floors, filled with people who had just watched his authority slip through his fingers like sand. Danielle Carter was gone. The doors had swung shut behind her, but the presence she left in the air lingered like the last words of an argument you didn't win. Holloway forced himself to straighten his posture, inhaling slowly, controlling his breath the way he always had. Control. That was his foundation. And yet, it felt shattered beneath him. The prosecutor cleared his throat, still seated, still gripping the case file that was now little more than a relic of a trial that had never truly existed. "Your Honor, is there anything else?" His voice was careful, respectful, but there was something else there too: uncertainty, hesitation. Holloway's eyes flickered to the jury. Most of them were still sitting there as if waiting for something more, some final word to bring the world back into balance. But there was nothing left to say. For the first time in years, Holloway felt what it was like to be on the other side of a judgment, and it was unbearable. The bailiff hesitated before stepping forward. "Court is adjourned." It was supposed to be Holloway's job to say that, but the words never came from him. He just sat there as the room around him shifted back into motion, chairs scraping against the floor, murmured conversations filling the space that had been swallowed by silence. Then something caught his eye: a folded piece of paper left on the defense table. It hadn't been there before. Holloway's body moved before his mind did, his fingers snatching up the note with a sharpness that surprised even him. The room around him blurred as he unfolded it, his eyes scanning the small, neat handwriting inside. "You spent years making people feel small in this room. I hope today you finally understand what that feels like. Next time, think before you laugh." There was no signature. There didn't need to be. Holloway's chest tightened. His fingers gripped the edges of the note so hard the paper crinkled beneath his touch. He swallowed, his throat dry, the words drilling into his mind with a sharpness that left no room for escape. For the first time in his career, Judge Holloway felt something new, something foreign, something he had never allowed himself to feel in this courtroom: regret. And the worst part? It wasn't going away.